At the start of the 1980s, General Motors didn't just sell midsize cars. They defined what American families drove. Their next act was supposed to cement that dominance. One bold platform, 5 brands, projections of engineering elegance and market control. Instead, delays, a catastrophic pivot from rear-wheel to front-wheel drive, and a price tag of $7 billion left General Motors late to its own party. What does it cost when an entire company bets on the wrong future? And how does a platform meant to preserve American supremacy end up marking its decline? This is where the GM10 disaster begins. Every driveway in America once felt like it belonged to General Motors. In the early 1980s, more than half the mid-size cars sold in the United States wore badges from Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, Buick, or Pontiac. These were not just cars, they were the backbone of family life, carrying kids to school, groceries home, and workers to the night shift. Dealerships stretched across the country, each one stocked with rows of sedans and coupes that seemed to confirm General Motors' place at the center of American routine. For millions, a General Motors midsize was not a question of loyalty or aspiration. It was simply what you bought next. The numbers made that confidence feel permanent. The Chevrolet Citation alone sold over 800,000 units in its first year. Oldsmobile's Cutlass Supreme was, for a time, the nation's best-selling car. General Motors' internal forecasts assumed this dominance would continue, projecting that their next platform could capture more than a fifth of the entire United States car market. In boardrooms and engineering offices, the idea that anyone could seriously threaten General Motors' grip on the family car segment seemed almost unthinkable. But the ground beneath that certainty was already shifting. Imports were rising, and new expectations for quality and efficiency were quietly taking hold. Still, in those years, General Motors' command over the American driveway felt as absolute as ever, an advantage that seemed too big to lose. 5 nameplates sat at the heart of GM10's strategy: Chevrolet Lumina, Pontiac Grand Prix, Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, Buick Regal, and in related planning documents, the Buick Skylark. The doctrine was simple on paper: one platform, 5 distinct models, each division preserving its styling autonomy and signature features. The engineering teams mapped out a unified chassis, aiming for efficiency and scale, without erasing the identities buyers expected from each badge. Early platform memos and technical sketches reveal a program rooted in the logic of consolidation, but still haunted by the legacy of rear-wheel drive excellence. The initial intent was to capture the best of both worlds: the solidity and driving feel of the outgoing G-body and A-body cars, paired with the packaging and efficiency advances that front-wheel drive promised. Divisional staffs pressed to keep their own engines, dashboards, and trim, leading to a platform that had to accommodate a bewildering array of mechanical and cosmetic differences. The original engineering posture was quietly ambitious: an upscale, technically advanced family car that could outclass Ford's offerings not just in volume, but in substance. Yet every new requirement, every insistence on brand-specific parts, multiplied the risk. The structure of the program itself, one platform, 5 visions, meant that even before the first prototype left the drawing board, compromise was baked into the steel. The outlines of a technical gamble were already visible, with the fate of GM's dominance riding on the ability to deliver both unity and distinction, scale and sophistication, all within a single engineering doctrine. A single directive set the GM10 program on a new course: front-wheel drive, mandated across all divisions. This decision was not a simple tweak. It triggered a cascade of redesigns that reached down to the core of every subsystem: engines, transmissions, suspension geometry, even the way the body panels met the frame. Tooling that had already been ordered, some of it installed at enormous cost, now had to be scrapped or reworked. The lead times for new stamping, dies stretched into months. Validation cycles, which had been mapped out for a rear-wheel drive chassis, had to begin again from scratch. The numbers tell the story with a kind of cold precision. The original budget for GM10 hovered near $5 billion. By the time the last invoice cleared, the sum approached $7 billion. That extra $2 billion did not buy innovation. It bought time lost to retooling, duplicated engineering, and the hard reality of starting over midstream. Plant tooling crews worked double shifts, tearing out fixtures that were obsolete before the first car rolled down the line. Suppliers renegotiated contracts. Every new requirement rippled outward, multiplying costs and pushing back launch dates. Meanwhile, Ford's Taurus appeared in showrooms in December 1985. Its aerodynamic shape and crisp handling became the new family car standard before GM10 prototypes were even roadworthy. Animated cost bars, once projected to give GM an unbeatable edge, now looked like a warning. The operational crisis was no longer theoretical. With every month lost and every dollar overspent, the ground slipped further away from GM's once unchallenged position. Honda Accord and Toyota Camry did not just sell well, they rewrote the rulebook for what a family car could be. By the mid-1980s, buyers who once defaulted to GM were now drawn to the quiet reliability and tight panel gaps of Japanese imports. The Accord's annual sales crossed 300,000 units by 1985, and Toyota's Camry, only a few years into its United States run, was gaining ground with every model update. Both cars delivered front-wheel drive not as a concession, but as a selling point. Better traction in winter, more space inside, and fewer mechanical headaches. On the domestic front, Chrysler's K-cars, once dismissed as basic, proved that American factories could build a front-wheel drive sedan for the masses. The Dodge Aries and Plymouth Reliant, launched in 1981, offered practical packaging and fuel efficiency at a price point GM could not ignore. By 1984, Chrysler had sold over 1 million K-car derivatives, and the press was quick to note their mechanical simplicity and surprising durability. These were not just sales successes, they were signals. Consumer Reports and Motor Trend filled columns with praise for the Accord's dependability and the K-car's pragmatic design. Letters to the editors shifted from complaints about squeaks and rattles to stories of cars passing 100,000 miles without drama. For GM, the old calculus of brand loyalty, showroom presence, and sheer volume no longer guaranteed a sale. Every month that the GM10 program spent retooling or revising specs, the window for reclaiming the family car crown narrowed. The market was moving on, and the timeline that once seemed generous was shrinking by the quarter. Inside the plants built for GM10, the difference between promise and reality was measured in hours and empty space. General Motors needed 35 hours to assemble each car, nearly double the 18 hours Ford required for a Taurus. Four dedicated factories, each designed for high-volume output, ran at less than half their intended capacity. Machines sat idle while line workers waited for parts, and whole shifts passed without enough bodies on the line or cars on the schedule. Inefficiency was not a fluke or a failure of skill. It was the result of a governance structure that prized consensus over clarity and process over outcome. Under Roger Smith, General Motors' leadership chart grew more complex, while its cars grew harder to build. Committee logic meant every division kept its own preferences, engines, dashboards, even washer fluid bottles, multiplying complexity where the program had promised unity. The numbers, 35 hours and under 50% utilization, were not just statistics. They were the visible cost of a system that could spend billions yet still lose ground with every car that left the line. Lloyd Roos carried the GM10 promise into boardrooms and onto factory floors, his name tied to the vision of a unified, world-beating platform. When the numbers could no longer be explained away, his exit came quietly. No press conference, no public reckoning, just a line in the business pages and a sudden vacancy at the top of North American operations. For workers, the consequences landed with more noise. Plants built for volume sat half-lit or shuttered entirely. Layoff notices arrived in waves, their language formal and impersonal, even as families faced the reality of lost paychecks and uncertain futures. Headlines chronicled the closures, but the stories behind them, decades of service and neighborhoods hollowed out, rarely made the news. Inside GM, the search for answers faded as quickly as the assembly lines. No formal post-mortem circulated, no autopsy report pinned blame or mapped the chain of decisions. The failure was absorbed into the silence of a system that preferred to forget. The verdict, if there is one, remains unfinished. Was this the fault of a few, or the inevitable outcome of a machine too large to learn from its own mistakes? Today, General Motors' share of the U.S. car market sits below 15%, less than half its 1980s peak. The GM10's $7 billion lesson remains. No amount of engineering talent can outpace a system that confuses consensus for vision. Inertia is not just expensive, it is fatal. What does your company prioritize?